So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center. And welcome to the virtual reading group. Today we're reading the essay Understanding and Politics. You'll see in the book, there's parentheses, the difficulties of understanding. This is one of my absolute favorite essays of Hannah Arendt. It's one of the most important essays that she wrote, I think, if you want to really understand not only her thinking about totalitarianism, but the transition of her thinking in the 1950s. So just a little bit of background on the essay. I don't usually do much of this, but in this one, I think it's quite important. This essay was published in 1953. I don't think it was 1954, as it says in the notes. It was in the July-August edition of the Partisan Review, volume 20 of 1953. And it's an interesting text in her writing at this time. As I think I've mentioned a few times, in the early 1950s and 1952, she writes the essay, which becomes Ideology and Terror, which becomes the final chapter of the second edition of The Origins. And she goes and gives 5 or 6 versions of that in speeches across Europe. And one idea is that in giving these speeches, she got a lot of questions and criticism. And as a result, still trying to think about what totalitarianism is, something she says she never really figured out when she wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism, she writes 4 manuscripts between 1952 and early 1953. The first one is the art on the nature of totalitarianism, which is going to be the next essay we read in this book. It actually was a longer essay and it was called On the Nature of Totalitarianism, an essay in understanding. And it actually was a very long essay that included, in a sense, both parts. They've been broken up here. She then writes another essay called The Great Tradition and the Nature of Totalitarianism. She then writes another essay called The Difficulties of Understanding, and that's why you'll see the difficulties of understanding in parentheses here. And then she writes another essay called Understanding and Politics, which is published in the Partisan Review. We don't actually have her typescript for Understanding and Politics. We only have the published version in the journal. But these 4 essays are clearly related. A lot of them are the same, but there's differences as well. And so this is the only one of them that she published. And so we're going to read it within that. But I think it is important to remember as we're reading it that it was originally written as part of a larger essay that included the next essay that we're going to read on the nature of totalitarianism. And it was originally written as part of I think a book project on rethinking totalitarianism, but really thinking about what she'll call the modern break in tradition. And so one of these chapters is The Great Tradition and the Nature of Totalitarianism. And so all of these are themes we're going to talk about. Okay, let me jump in because this is a complicated essay in many ways. It begins with this epigraph from Kafka. In English, basically, it is difficult to say the truth. For those of you who read with us the essay on Lessing about 6-7 months ago, to say the truth is hard, Kafka says, because even though there's only one truth, es gibt nur eine, it is a living truth, and it therefore has a living and changing or changing face. So the truth has a face that changes. Why is this the epigraph? Well, the basic thesis here is about understanding, which she's going to say is almost impossible. And it's a lifelong project. It's something like truth, which is living, understanding is living, and we're going to have to try and figure out what she means by that. So she begins the essay and says, "Thankfully, we don't need to understand totalitarianism to fight it." Very simple, but I think there's a couple things already here. One is, what is the context of her thinking? It is how to fight totalitarianism. I don't think we should forget that. And in order to fight totalitarianism, that means that this is part of her considerations about totalitarianism. And what she says is, in some sense, we need to understand it, but thankfully, we don't need to fully understand it. Why? Because that would be hopeless. We can't. And so, in a way, what are we about to read? We're about to read an essay called Understanding in Politics, in which we learn why it is that we cannot fully understand totalitarianism, and yet why the effort to understand totalitarianism is maybe the greatest and most important activity of politics that we can engage in today. So what is understanding? She says a number of things. She says it's a complicated process that never produces unequivocal results. Okay, I think that's fairly clear. It's not about knowledge. It's not about finding some answer. To understand is not about any result. It's an unending activity. So it has no end. It's something we do all our lives. It's an unending activity by which we, and here are key words, come to terms with and reconcile ourselves to reality. It's how we try to become at home in the world. We reconcile ourselves to reality. Reconciliation, she says, is not the same as forgiveness. So it's not, to reconcile to reality doesn't mean we condone reality or we forgive reality. Forgiveness is, we say, okay, we're done. Understanding is constant. Reconciliation is constant. It's unending. It starts with birth and it ends with death. We come to terms with not by condoning or forgiving, but by understanding. What does that mean? Reconciling. What does that mean? Well, one answer is to try and be at home in the world. This idea of reconciliation, Versöhnung in German, which she takes somewhat from Hegel, although in a critical way, is about how it is that we as human beings seek to make the world our own, come to be at home in it. Now, for Hegel, reconciliation is an intellectual attempt to give the world intellectual meaning. And in doing so, to rationalize the world and, in a sense, therefore, even justify it or excuse it, to make sense of it. Arendt is going to have a very different view of reconciliation. She's going to say that in the post-totalitarian world, or the world that is a world that has had totalitarianism in it, we have to live in the world and reconcile ourselves and understand the world in such a way that we recognize the unreconcilability of the world, its irrationality, that it no longer is one that we can fully intellectually justify and make sense of, and yet somehow still reconcile ourselves to that unreconcilable, irreconcilable world. She then says that there's a danger here, which is the danger she calls indoctrination. You can't seek to rush reconciliation or understanding. If you try and come up with some answer, right? If you're Hegel and you say, I know the world's spirit and I can make the world into spirit and therefore rationalize it. She says in a world in which is unreconcilable or irreconcilable, I never know exactly which one to use, all attempts to actually come up with an answer are like indoctrination and are thus a kind of violence. And what the mistake they make is they seek to escape the infinity of understanding, its unending activity. And they seek to transcend the solid realm of facts and figures. They retreat from what for her is one of the absolute basic truths of the modern world, which is its irreconcilability and its irrationality. There's no rational coherence to it. Against this indoctrination of a kind of Hegelian rational reconciliation, understanding as reconciliation, as an eternal activity, complicated process, an unending activity, this understanding seeks meaning, she says. This is on page 308 to 309. She says, the result of understanding at the top of 309 is meaning, which we originate in the very process of living insofar as we try to reconcile ourselves to what we do and what we suffer. Now, one thing I want to point out is that she's writing this again in 1952, 1953, publishes it in 1953. In 1953, in her Denktagebuch, she writes a sentence which reads this: understanding creates depth, not meaning. Right? So she says here, the result of understanding is meaning, which we originate in the very process of living, insofar as we try to reconcile ourselves to what we do and what we suffer. Yet in the Denktagebuch, written at about the exact same time, she writes, understanding creates depth, underlined, not meaning. Politically, this is the same as becoming, making oneself at home, underlined, in the world. It is the process of Verwurzelung, or building roots, or setting roots. So I think, what do you make of the fact that in one place she says it's depth, not meaning, and in the other place she says it's meaning? Not so much. I think the point is to understand what she's trying to say, which is that understanding creates depth, not meaning. It creates depth or it creates meaning, insofar as in one place she says we originate in the very process of living, insofar as we try to reconcile ourselves to what we do and suffer. And in the other, she says it's the process of becoming, of making oneself at home in the world, of digging and setting in roots. We need to dig and set in roots and become at home in the world and originate this process of living and reconcile ourselves to what we do and what we suffer. And how do we do that? How do we understand? Well, not by seeking analogies with the past. They are inadequate. We have to understand that the world we live in now, the world of the totalitarian world, is a new and original and horrible world. We have to understand, she says, the break with tradition. And now she lets fall a sentence on page 310, which is actually going to be repeated 4 times in this essay. It's a 12 or 13 page essay. And she repeats one sentence 4 times in it. Which I have to say is somewhat shocking. But it says on 310, totalitarianism, totalitarian actions, this is at the very top of 310, have clearly exploded our categories of political thought and our standards of judgment. this idea that totalitarianism has clearly exploded our categories of thought and our standard of judgment is obviously one deeply important to her. She also repeats it in other essays written around this time. She repeats it 4 times in this essay. What does she mean by it? Well, she gives a couple of examples here and elsewhere. One is that she talks about the failure of the Nuremberg trials, the failure to reduce the effort to reduce what the Nazis did in the Nuremberg trials, the genocide, to criminal law, to murder. And she says, there's no criminal law analog of what the Nazis did. It's something sui generis, something new. And so we can no longer understand the dehumanization of totalitarianism with our typical categories of murder, of political thought, of legal thought, or political thought. She'll also say, and we've talked about this a fair bit in this book, that one of our basic ways of approaching the world is utilitarian, right? That we think that there's a means-end rationality and that the ends justify the means, and that things are there and we do things because they're useful. But in totalitarianism, the camps were not useful. They actually, were counterproductive at points. The amount of time and effort and manpower that the Nazi wasted in keeping these camps around. And so she wants to say that it explodes our categories of political thought, totalitarianism. And then she's going to argue that it also eviscerates or makes a mockery of the idea of common sense or common standards, which are those judgments that we share about the world. And so explodes our categories of political thought and our standards of judgment. The argument here is that totalitarianism is so horrifically new, is such a break with what came before, is the actual event of the breaking of the Western tradition, that we no longer can think along the same categories or judge with standards of judgment that we have grown up with for thousands of years. Okay, the next point she wants to make is that even if understanding totalitarianism can't yield results, it is part of the fight against totalitarianism. Right? I said before, this is the context, fighting against totalitarianism. So why is that? Why is understanding so important? Well, we know what we're fighting against to some sense, at least on a preliminary level. And here she makes this distinction between preliminary understanding of totalitarianism and understanding of totalitarianism. The preliminary understanding of totalitarianism is pretty simple. It's a radical elimination of freedom. And in this sense, it's a bit like tyranny. It's a bit like authoritarianism or tyranny or any of those. And she says that that preliminary understanding that totalitarianism is the evisceration of freedom may actually be the only effective way to prevent people from joining totalitarian movements. You can't teach them about totalitarianism and then they'll say, I'm not going to join. There's no amount of education that you're going to give them that's going to make them not join a totalitarian movement. What makes people not join is a preliminary intuition, an understanding, a preliminary understanding that totalitarianism is the evisceration of freedom. Understanding itself, though, is not just this preliminary understanding. And so if understanding itself is not going to potentially add to people's resistance to totalitarianism, because they're largely going to resist it based on this preliminary understanding, why do we need understanding, right? Why do we need this second level of understanding that she talks about? And she says, well, we got to follow some clues. And the first clue comes from popular language. and namely the fact that we have this new word, totalitarianism, and that maybe it's different from tyranny. It's different from other forms of government that are also eviscerations of freedom. And so what we need to now do is say, what is it about totalitarianism that makes it new, makes it different? And here she again on page 313 repeats that same line again. She says in the middle of the page, yet has not the task of understanding become hopeless if it is true that we are confronted with something which has destroyed our categories of thought and our standards of judgment. So here's the second repetition. How can we understand if we are living in a time in which our categories of thought and standards of judgment have been destroyed? And she says maybe we just have to resign ourselves to this preliminary understanding. And yet, she says, the paradox of this modern situation is that we have lost our tools of understanding, our quest for meaning, the tools that allow us to quest for meaning. We have lost our ability to originate meaning, right? And thus we are at sea, or we are within a world, a totalitarian world, or a world in which totalitarianism has happened and is still present as a possibility, in which there's the growth of meaninglessness, which has been accompanied by the loss of common sense. We are alone, right? Alone in the sense of lonely. And we have no common standards. She says in another quote in the Denk Tagebuch, right? This is the last one I'll bring up here today, but they're helpful. She says at one point, and I'm translating from the German, understanding is the thinking of being by oneself, Einsamkeit. Judging is the thinking of being together with others, and the controlling against others, and that's having common sense, the being in a common world. Schließen, logical deduction, is the thinking of loneliness or being abandoned. This is in the Denk Tagebuch from December of 1952. And so what's being said here is that what totalitarianism is not only the destruction of, our categories of thought, law, utilitarianism, means ends rationality, but also our capacity for judgment, the common world, our ability to originate meaning, to set roots, and thus we are isolated and left alone. This is important, she says, and here she turns to Montesquieu, because she says that what Montesquieu understood as he wrote about the danger to the European world was that only customs prevented a spectacular moral and spiritual breakdown of Occidental culture. Only common sense. Montesquieu understood that laws govern citizens, the actions of citizens, but customs govern the action of men. And that with the downfall of nations begins the downfall of lawfulness. But what still remains are customs and patterns of morality. And it's only traditions that can be trusted to prevent the worst, but only for a limited time. Every incident, every abuse of power can destroy customs and morality so that they no longer have their foundations or their instantiation in laws. What brought the downfall of customs, Arendt says, in the 19th century was the Industrial Revolution. And now, with the rise of the 20th century and the rise of totalitarianism, she says we learn why our great tradition has remained so peculiarly silent. The very sources from which such answers should have sprung have dried up. It is the loss of these customs, of this common world, of our roots, of that we live together in a world, which she says has made the tradition silent, and left human beings as what she calls a flexible being. And what totalitarianism says about human beings is that they can be changed. They can be made not social animals, but lonely mass animals, and they can be made to give up the quest for meaning and understanding. And that the loss of this depth by means of terror combined with ideological thinking. So remember, sort of the two main elements of totalitarianism that she comes to identify in the early 1950s are terror and ideology. And what both do is they isolate man. They destroy the common world, the common sense, and they replace it with logical reasoning, a sterile commonality without a bond to the world. And so then she comes into her conclusion. She says, for those of us who are engaged in the quest for meaning, who seek to understand the world, who seek to reconcile ourselves with the world, what is frightening, the word she uses is frightening, what is frightening in totalitarianism is not the killing, and not that it is new, but that it has brought to light the ruin of our categories of thought and our standards of judgment, the third repetition, right? Why is that so frightening? Where again, the Hegelian project of reconciliation or of understanding was to understand the world rationally, to justify, to rationalize what is, and in a sense to then reconcile it. It's frightening because we now live in a world, as Arendt will say, in the human condition. This is why this is partly the transition to the human condition, where we can no longer reconcile ourselves to the world as a rational project according to our categories of thoughts and our standards of judgments. The world is no longer one we can fully comprehend in a way that we make sense of. And that's frightening because if we can't love the world, right? Amor mundi, such an important part of Arendt's world. If we can't love the world, if we can't reconcile ourselves to the world, how can we go on? And then she comes to, I think, what's her answer to this, which is that politics is about beginnings. And she cites Augustine, the famous line, again, which is so important in the human condition. Initium ergo ut esset, creatus est homo ante quem nullis fuit, that there might be a beginning, man was created, before whom nobody was. That this original character of man is that even living in a world without banisters, even in a world without standards of judgment and without categories of thought, man, and again, here she repeats it again on 321, to understand that which has ruined our categories of thought and our standards of judgment appears less frightening. So here now it's less frightening when we understand that man is a beginning. When we understand that the human condition is one of natality, of beginning, of being able to start over. So what is being said? That understanding totalitarianism is not helpful in opposing it insofar as we only really need the preliminary understanding for that, right? That it's the evisceration of freedom. But it is part of the fight against totalitarianism for this reason, is that the only way to really confront totalitarianism is not just rearguard actions of fighting against it, but of starting something new, of building a new world, one in which there is a new Verwurzelung, a new rooting in of a home, a new common world emerging. And that, she says in the last page of the essay, is the task of understanding, which she now renames imagination, right? She says imagination alone enables us to see things in their proper perspective, to be strong enough to put that which is too close at a certain distance so that we can see and understand it without bias and prejudice, to be generous enough to bridge the abysses of remoteness until we can see and understand everything that is too far away from us, as though it were our own affair. And this imagination where we bridge a remoteness and we allow distance is part of what she's going to call the dialogue of understanding. The dialogue of understanding. And in this dialogue of understanding, what she calls an interminable dialogue, which we do not tire of, that is the dialogue in which, in talking to one another, in listening and imagining ways in which we can talk to each other, we can begin to build roots and build a home and reconcile ourselves in some way to a common world. And that is the way that understanding, as imagination, as the internal dialogue, is the work of politics, insofar as what understanding does is act in such a way that we build a common world, which is the work of politics. All right. I think I'll stop there. Like I said, this is to me one of her greatest and most profound works. And happy to take questions and thoughts. I see there's already a ton of comments in the chat. But I also see some hands up. So let me start with Ayala.
Oh, okay.
Or do you want to wait?
Thank
Ayala?
you. Thank you. No. I want to check with you. This is a little hard to digest at the beginning, but later on, when I thought I understood her understanding. We are using this word maybe in many different ways. I want to check with you, Roger, and with everybody that I really understand it as it pertains to exactly the world now, with two main challenges, which is the extinction, the sixth extinction of climate change, and the pandemic. So first I try to give synonyms to what she was talking about. We must get into a basic understanding. It is not resignation. Oh, she talked about reconciliation. It's not resignation, it's not recognition. It's not digesting. Maybe she means managing, coping, making sense. And then I thought, actually, she might refer to the fact that we have to be in contact with reality as to integrate it into our mental paradigm as something that is, that it exists, rather than what happens now a lot with the way a lot of people cope is denial or appropriation, or dressing it with a different gown that will allow them to swallow it or to boil in it. That makes sense to me, that in order not to deny, not to redress it, and in fact, as an opportunity to see new possibilities and act on it, we first must to have some understanding of it, not digestion. So that's how I understood it. And then the world of politics, I think that today the management might be a little different than the world of politics due to a loss of complete trust in the effectiveness of politics. But did I get it?
Thanks, Ayala. I mean, I don't. So there's a lot that you said that I think gets it. I'm not sure some of it. I'm not sure about the word management. But let me say a few things, and then you tell me if I got it. I think you're absolutely right about her worry that we deny reality. Right. This is a theme that I've been bringing up and focusing on. It's, I think, one of the most important themes of her work. And there are many ways that she thinks we deny reality. A few are we turn to theories or speculations. Intellectuals, she says, deny reality insofar as they try and seek root causes of things. And they try and rationalize things and provide plausible explanations for things, which deny reality insofar as reality is often quite implausible and crazy and irreconcilable. And so that's one way we deny reality. Another is through the idea of progress. Insofar as progress thinks that the world is improving and moving towards some better idea, that, of course, she thinks is a denial of reality. Another is advertising and the rise of public relations, which seeks to work with images and make us do things like consume things we don't need, which again rejects reality in many ways, or allows us to create an image or reality of a world that is dangerous or anarchic, which may be in our political interests. What is understanding as not any of those, and not simply knowledge of the world? It is, as there's a lot of words she uses to talk about it. Understanding is the search, is reconciliation. That's the first thing she says. It is the search to reconcile ourselves, to be at home in the world. And yet, and here's what I was trying to say, it's not reconciliation and being at home in the sense that the world is at peace or that the world makes sense in the Hegelian sense. The hard part is that we have to reconcile ourselves to being at home in a world that is suffering from what she calls this break with tradition, the break in tradition, the fact that we've lost our concepts of thought and our standards, our standard judgments, criteria of judgments. And in such a world, what understanding can mean as part of the fight is that we engage in what she calls this interminable, unending, infinite dialogue, which is, she thinks, the only way to not just resist totalitarianism, but to, in a sense, try and rebuild a world, and thus provide a haven, a world, a common world, in which we would be at home. And that is what she means by politics. Politics is the action in concert with others, in such a way that we build new things, in this case, a common world. I don't know. Did I get your question? I mean,
somewhat. It is certainly not the verstehen.
Well, that's the word she's using. She's obviously using it in a particular way. she's not using it. She's trying to, she's using it in her way, which is to understand as to reconcile and be in an interminable dialogue with the imagination. So at the end, she'll say, understanding is imagination.
Okay.
You have to, I understand this is not the way other people use the word understanding. But, she's trying to say something and make this world mean something. She uses different words for this throughout her text, throughout her life. In some of her most private writings, and in almost all of her major books, she uses the word reconciliation, Versöhnung. But she doesn't ever thematize it fully in her work. In these texts of this period, she uses the word understanding. I think in some of her texts, thinking is a word she'll use for this. So in The Life of the Mind, she'll say that thinking is the quest for meaning. Well, here she says understanding is the quest for meaning. One of the things that is, I think, wonderful and also somewhat difficult about Arendt is she's not someone who has a very strict vocabulary. Throughout her life, she'll use different words to mean similar things, depending on who she's talking to and how she's feeling at that moment, or why I don't know why. The challenge with Arendt is to understand the flexibility and yet precision of her language in each particular case. Okay, Rick.
Yes, hello. I don't really have a question. I think I'm just going to basically say what you've already said, but in kind of different words. But I want to add in something about the totalitarianism. But I think my favorite sentence on here is 3:11, but it's only one sentence. Then to compare that with a section you read in the very opening of the text, which says, understanding precedes and succeeds knowledge. So the idea that this understanding, this thing we're trying to get our hands around, comes before and also comes after knowledge. So it's not like we did this or we achieved that. It's what helps create this circle. And I think that feeds into what she says in the beginning, this unending activity to try to be at home in the world. And I think in order to get home in the world, that's where this circularity between understanding and knowledge comes in. I think to her to be at home in the world, I don't like the idea about making roots, although of course she says that, that's what she means. But I like to think of it more as a constant engagement, a constant back and forth between us and the world and us and other human beings in the world. That's, that kind of engagement, which I think gets back to what you said before about this certain kind of distance and just going back and forth through this distance. There's an engagement that is like the heart of what it means to be human. I think that's what she's picking up on. And which I think is why she says it's vicious, but she puts vicious in quotes, of course, because it's not a horrific circle. It's not something to be avoided. We should embrace the circularity, embrace the fact that we can never, ever get to like the end kind of thing. That it's the pleasure in the doing, that kind of stuff. But why that's important to her, I think, is because that's where this idea of freedom, which is tied into the idea of a promise and forgiveness. So freedom, of course, isn't like I get to choose 10 different cereals for breakfast, or I get to choose what my career is. Freedom is I can make a promise to define the future, or I can forgive, which is to, sort of sense, wipe out the past. That's kind of what makes the causal change, the natural law of causality, really, really does not like at all. And I think that's what becomes critical to her. And if you take those out of the equation, that's where we lose our humanity. We get to the totalitarianism, Russian, the Stalin totalitarianism, which is following the laws of history. History understood as far as what's the cause and effect. And she does not like that idea of history, or that idea of history is fine, but let's not get that idea of history into political science, because that's going to really screw up all the political science if we have the idea of causality, cause and effect. But the Stalinist Russia, of course, is we are following the laws of history, the law of the class struggle. And the German totalitarianism, of course, is we're following the laws of biology, the survival of the fittest. It's like in the other Arendt essays we read, where Arendt is constantly saying how Hitler always said, I'm following this cold analytical logic. Well, she didn't say analytical, I'm throwing that in.
Yeah.
I'm following this cold logic. Like, how can you deny logic? How could he deny that 2 + 2 = 4? That's something beyond the human condition. So when we fall into that, and it's really easy to comfortable to say, I'm following the laws of logic, right? That's really comfy zone. I don't have to make decisions anymore. I don't have to make promises. I don't have to forgive people. I can follow the laws of logic, which I think is why it's easy to fall into these things, which she wants to bring a break to. So I think when she said we lost our categories of understanding, you know, we haven't lost a way to like get our hands around totalitarianism. We lost the categories of understanding about what it means to be human, which is freedom, which is promising and forgiving. That's the kind of thing which constantly keeps us interacting back and forth with each other, engagement with the world. That's the thing that's important for political science, which is why we want to stay away from causing effective history and get that off the table.
Great. Thank you, Rick. I think that's great. I think I'll take that as a comment, which is, I'm glad you got to the heart of the essay. Alex.
Hi there. Thanks, Roger, for hosting this meeting. I want to bring up something that was, I guess, a question that's coming up for me as I read this, and something that seems like it's an open end in this paper, and maybe it's going to be taken up in her future essays. But the question is basically, what is the difference between the kind of newness that belongs to totalitarianism and the kind of newness that Arendt is bringing up as, you know, the work of understanding, the work of natality. So there's a sentence here on the bottom of 309 where she says, the originality of totalitarianism is horrible, not because some new idea came into the world, but because its very actions constitute a break with all our traditions. They have clearly exploded our categories of political thought and our standards for moral judgment. So it seems like totalitarianism, it exceeds, you know, that pre-understanding. It also exceeds our scientific understanding. You know, so it seems to go into that third sphere where we find imagination and we find this freedom. And yet totalitarianism, it's kind of like, seems like it would be the, you know, the shadow of that, or somehow the opposite of that. And what's coming to mind is, you know, the struggle between like a kind of life force and then something oriented in some way towards death. So she says later on, you know, the task is to think this essence of totalitarianism. And I'm very curious about that. You know, what is that essence? It seems like maybe it's connected with, you know, bringing things to an end in some way rather than opening new beginnings. And I'm wondering if I'm on the right track with that.
So a lot, I think you're on the right track of. The last thing you said, I think, might have been mixed up or reversed. The thinking of totalitarianism, the understanding of totalitarianism, is about creating new beginnings, not bringing to an end. In fact, she says in a very controversial line in Ideology and Terror, near the end of Ideology and Terror, which is now the last chapter of The Origins of Totalitarianism, she says that in some ways we should be thankful for totalitarianism. You know, not, I mean, obviously she's being you have to be careful about this, but insofar as it makes us aware of the break of our traditions and thus allows us to start anew, just to start the work again of understanding. The essence of totalitarianism, which we'll read more about next week in the next essay on the nature of totalitarianism, which is about the essence of totalitarianism, is going to be primarily two: terror and ideology or logicality. And then a third element as well is going to be loneliness, or the rise of mass loneliness, which makes man susceptible to ideology in its most logical forms. You know, I think where you started, Alex, is really interesting to say that, she talks about the newness of totalitarianism, and that its horror is that it makes us aware of, and it actually is the break of tradition. And then she'll talk about the newness of man, right? Where she's quoting Augustine on uh, on 321 and 322. The idea here is that what makes man is that he is a beginner, that he can bring new things into being. I think what she is getting at is that what she sees the essence of totalitarianism to be, Alex, is the use of terror and ideology to stamp out the spontaneity and originality and active capacity of man, right? And that, in a way, what she wants to say is that totalitarian government is actually only a particular manifestation of an underlying trend of modern society to stamp out the originality and active capacity of man. And in a way, having gone through totalitarianism in such a horrific manner, if we seek to understand it, we can be made aware that the danger that it represents to humanity, to human originality, is only an extreme version of a danger which actually we can find in intellectuals, in Marxists and capitalists, in public relations, and in the general flight from reality and a desire to scientifically understand in Hegelian sense and control the human world. And as a result, if we actually do think through totalitarianism and seek to understand it, we can be made aware of the danger in a way that can potentially spur us to act again, and to reassert, to reimagine our humanity as acting beings. And that's what and she calls that the capacity of the activity of thinking, the activity of acting, the activity of understanding, the activity of reconciling, the activity of imagining. These are all words for her of what it means to be human, that she thinks the modern world is suppressing, and that totalitarianism was the greatest event of that suppression. And so, in a way, the fact of totalitarianism makes us aware of a danger that we were already suffering under, but weren't aware of. And only the fact of totalitarianism has allowed us to begin the process of becoming aware of it. Does that make sense, Alex? I mean, don't know if you agree with her or me, but I'm just trying to, I think, articulate what I think she's after.
Yes, it does make sense. I can see how, this essence or nature of totalitarianism, it's geared in every way to stamping out, like you were saying, this the spontaneity or the freedom of political action and imagination. And that's what I meant by the endings, that it seems that the essence of totalitarianism has to do with bringing things to an end and stifling creativity and freedom.
Yeah.
And then what's interesting is, when she speaks of understanding, this comes up a few times just here and there, that to understand is in some way to surpass. And really that to understand, in a sense, fully, is to see something from the standpoint of its end, where something new can begin, right? So it seems that that work of understanding itself helps us to take a step beyond totalitarianism.
Yeah, I think that's right. Great. Thank you, Alex. Hal.
Yeah, no, one thing I put this question. Arendt seems to be calling to question ideological if-then that statements, basically in literally the sense of like ideologics that generate thought. So the idea of in ideologies that something's going to happen as a result of something else because an idea said so, not because it actually needs to be true, because this system of thought said so. In practice, though, totalitarian movements that have taken power have basically made those flesh in a sense that in Nazi Germany, being a Jew did mean you were inferior, if only in the legal sense. How can people use something like common sense in this situation when basically they're in a place where these totalitarian logics are already operating? I mean, I guess a good example is racism. Like, there are racist structures in America, yet at the same time, like, ideally, we'd aspire to a society that doesn't see people through the lens of race at all. So how do we operate in this society, on one hand, trying to advance the idea that race shouldn't matter, but on the other hand, having to acknowledge that in practice, race does matter because of the way our structures operate?
That's a great question. Um, um, well, I think if you look at if you look at Nazism as a fully as a government that actualized a racist ideology, um, I think the point is that it eviscerated reality and it replaced reality with a series of logical deductions. And so Jews were vermin, whether or not they were, you know, and there was no amount of reality that could interfere with that. And one of the things that she talks about, as you very rightly and I think astutely pointed out, is that what we've learned from totalitarianism is that they are powerful enough that they can actually create reality in line with their logical demands. They can make Jews into vermin, and make them into people who are trying to cross borders, begging for mercy without any money, and and etc. And that's part of the experiment. And the camps were the highest experiment of that, of trying to turn Jews into dehumanized, superfluous human vermin. Um, uh, and so, if you turn to a country that's a non-totalitarian country, in her mind, like the United States, um, and many others, you can certainly, I think you can see a number of things. You can see the appeal of ideologies and logical thinking, I mean, is enormous right now. I mean, the 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 uh, the reality, the flight from reality of those who would like to create and think through racism right now is extraordinary. And yet it is powerful and it has some purchase. I don't think it has had the ability to totally succeed as it did, or close to totally succeed as it did in the camps or in Nazi Germany at all, but it's there. And I think the question is, and that's one thing we can see, but we can also see the breakdown of, as she said, the common standards and the concepts of thinking. How do we today think about race? Do we have a common world? Do we have common judgments, a common sense that we share? And increasingly, it seems that that's in doubt. And I think that's part of what she's saying, is that what totalitarianism did is destroy that. We can cover over it and sort of make believe that those things exist. But in some way, part of what she's saying we have to understand is that that common world is largely gone, that those common senses are gone. Now, you know, does that mean we should just not try and hold on to what we have and let chaos reign? I don't know. I don't think that's her point at all. Um, um, but I do think she believes that we are always in danger of totalitarianism or things like totalitarianism now, because the customs and common sense that we, in the common world that we do have, are in a sense patched together from broken strands and pillars of tradition, and yet we don't really know what we're believing. I mean, I think this is the she uses this word here, which she uses in a number of other essays in the 1950s, that we know what we're fighting against, but we don't know what we're fighting for. This has become, in my reading of Arendt, one of the more meaningful phrases that she uses, and she uses it in many places. And I think that we know what we're fighting against, and we're sort of willing to sort of compromise and hold things together, but we're not really willing to risk articulating what we're fighting for and fight for it, because we're afraid that if we do, we might lose and all hell might break loose. And so I take that to be where understanding aims at, is to having the deeper depth conversations that begin to articulate a new understanding of what we might fight for, that might create a new political world. Not sure I can do much more than that. Hal, it's a great question.
Yeah, no, the only other thing I guess the thing I want to clarify is, because there are examples of ideologics that exist, that seem to exist in the United States, such as the disproportionate amount of African American men that are shot by police officers, which some people argue is due to like racist logic. So that's a racial logic already in place in the United States, even though the United States isn't a totalitarian society in the same way Nazi Germany was. There's still some things that are ideologics that in theory are based in unjust things, such as the idea that black people are inferior, but nonetheless exist within our society, and those create.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I understand that. I mean, the fact that African American men are harassed and arrested and bothered and suppressed and oppressed by the police more than whites is a fact. I don't know how it's an ideal logic.
But is it based on racist ideas? Like, in other words, like, does that occur because of the existence of racist ideas? Is that already racist? The impact of race?
The answer to that,
going into the creation of the structure that currently exists.
I think that's a really complicated question. And I'm not sure I can. Why it happens is complicated. And I think it happens for a lot of reasons. It's going to have to do with race, power, class, imaginary, psychology. I think there's going to be a lot of reasons for it. And I think the effort to make one reason for it paramount is what she would call a flight from reality. It's a plausible speculation. That doesn't mean we shouldn't understand that race is important. I don't think that's what she means at all, or it's not what I'm saying. But I don't think she wants to say that there's one logic or causal logic behind it.
No, I think that's probably correct. There are many aspects of that.
And in any case, it's not, even if there were a logic behind it, there's certainly not one total logic dominating in the country right now. So it's certainly different. We're not in a totalitarian moment, at least not right now. Okay? Margaret.
Hi. I have two very specific textual questions. The first one is the reference on page 308, I believe, that only bad books make good weapons. And, you know, what I've been thinking about all week is really find me a sacred text that hasn't been weaponized pretty successfully. So I don't see how that serves her point, I guess. And my other question is, I think it's page 317, where she starts talking about logicality and problems with that. And it seems to me there's a muddle between validity and soundness. I mean, yeah, of course, you can have logically valid arguments that are not true. But there's a difference between truth and validity. And it, you know, I would think that that would be in line with what she's trying to say, but she seems to kind of conflate those. So I got confused by that. And I guess just quickly, I would say one point that keeps occurring to me over and over is that, you know, what I got from this essay more than many of the things we've read of hers is that no one of these principles is something like is the rock that we just stand on. You know, okay, I'm going to stand on understanding. I'm going to stand on logic. I'm going to stand on imagination. There has to be, it seems, some movement in between them as we act and experience our way in the world. So that's, but the book thing really, that really threw me. So I don't know what she's getting at there, or if that was just a throwaway line I should try to ignore.
Thanks. No, I don't think it's a throwaway line. I mean, I think what she's saying is that understanding is never going to give you answers. And as a result, understanding doesn't lead to the ability to indoctrinate or teach people what the right answer is. So she says, you know, well-meaning people, us, teachers, intellectuals, whatever you want to call us, want to cut the process of understanding short to educate others and elevate public opinion. We want to go out and tell people, you know, you should not drive, or you should, wear a mask, or you should not be racist, or whatever it is. We want to educate and elevate public opinion. And we think that we can use books as weapons to say, read this book, right? I mean, if there's one example of this, it's, you know, the people who tell you, read the books, do the work, read Robin DiAngelo. If you haven't read it, you know, you haven't read it, right? I mean, you know, you get this now, right? It's being said, books are being weaponized. If you haven't read Robin DiAngelo's book, you're a racist. And that's the weaponization, the elevation of education, and the idea that we can, and she calls that indoctrination.
What about, I mean,
you know, if I were to say to you, if you haven't read
New
Hannah Arendt, you can't,
Quran?
if I were to say to you, if you haven't read Hannah Arendt, you can't be a good citizen, that would be weaponizing it. That would be indoctrinating. It's stupid.
No, I get that, but I just keep thinking, you know, think Old Testament, think Quran, think New Testament. I mean, these books have been used in some sort of, sorry, but it's the word that comes to mind, bastardized form of the books themselves as very effective weapons.
Yeah.
Now, does that mean that they're staying true to those texts? No, but they've certainly been utilized and are being utilized in political forms and in ways to, you know, restrict and curtail people's lives in our world today. So, and that's not something that like just happened in 2020, you know? So it seems like a lot of things can be effective weapons. I mean, does she mean only effective weapons for good as opposed to effective weapons for bad? Because they seem to be very effective for bad.
I mean, I think books are somewhat of a red herring here. She's not talking about books per se. She's talking about words, ideas. And what she's saying is anyone who thinks they know the truth and that you can impose the truth on someone else seeks to indoctrinate, not to understand. I mean, it's a simple point. She's just using books, I think, as a shorthand for, you know, for that idea. I'm actually not sure I understand what you're objecting to in it, Margaret, because it just seems, I'm not sure I understand the controversy behind it, but, I mean, she wants to basically say that if you try and tell people, here's the truth, here's what it is, that's indoctrination, and it doesn't actually lead to, it's dangerous because she says it springs from a perversion of understanding. Understanding doesn't lead us to truth. It doesn't lead us to knowledge.
No.
It leads us to meaning or depth and roots. And so she's saying that's the point she's trying to make here. On the other point, and to speak about truth again on 317, I'll say, I mean, I think you're right, but what she says is that logicality and validity are not truth. But she says in a world of logicality and validity, truth becomes indeed what some logicians pretend it is, namely consistency, except that this equation actually implies the negation of the existence of truth, insofar as truth is always supposed to reveal something. So, I mean, what she's saying is that in a world of logicality, we negate truth, insofar as we try and make truth into correctness or consistency. No? Yes? Did I not understand the question? I sort of feel like I maybe didn't understand either question, because it seems to me you would agree with her on these.
I think that I understand her point of why you can't get to some sort of unique truth in these ways. I understand the levels that she's talking about, but I'm saying that I think her examples seem flawed to me because they seem divorced from the way those concepts actually are. I don't know that, I mean, logic, like I said, logic does distinguish between validity and soundness. And there are things that, you know, you can start your argument in QAnon and you can proceed logically and you can come up with a conclusion and someone can follow to that conclusion and believe it. That's you know, that happens. We see that around us in all different levels. But that's not truth, you know, just because someone believes it. And so I don't think she's being clear about these examples, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think she's talking about logicians. She's talking about what's QAnon or the Nazis or the Soviets. And the point is that for them, whether Hitler believed it or not, who knows? But the point is, millions of people did. And logicality makes a claim for consistency. And what she wants to argue is that in a world of where people feel adrift and rootless and lonely in the sense of being abandoned, consistency is enough, and they will choose consistency over meaning because meaning is not clear and consistency is, and gives them a sense of power and purpose in the world. Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, it's a good point. Nancy, let's go. We got a bunch of questions. I see. We're gonna have a hard. Oh my God. I'm gonna try and move faster. Nancy.
Okay, I had just a sense right now at this historic moment of being too susceptible to the day-to-day fluctuations in terms of power. And so my first question a while ago was the relationship of, say, being dominated or having sort of losing political I understand politics as dialogue, as a ideal, but when there's so much polarization and there's so much danger of being on the losing side, I'm dealing with that right now, today and yesterday and tomorrow, and I'm not feeling as if I can step back. It's fine to say, okay, we're not in a totalitarian moment, but we do see the dangers. And it's almost, I'm always looking to the readings we have in Hannah Arendt to see if I can get a glimmer of strategy or a way to conceptualize what we're going through day to day. But I feel so much in the fray that it's really hard to be to benefit or to, and she, of course she doesn't have answers, but this vision of having a voice which is not claiming to be an authority, but which is in a kind of relationship with others seems very promising to me. I'm sorry I went on too long, but that's.
No, look, Nancy, I think you're articulating what a lot of us feel. Again, just like when I was talking to Margaret, this book is not supposed to tell us the answers. And, I think if we read it for the answers, we do her and ourselves a disservice. She's not out here trying to indoctrinate us, tell us the answers. She's trying to think what we're doing, and our political moment right now is our political moment, and it's going to require a bunch of different kinds of responses, some of which may be understanding and thoughtful, and some of which may be courageous, and some of which may be violent. And I mean, Hannah Arendt is never going to tell you that you should never fight, right? I mean, she doesn't say that. She's not against violence. She is against violence in the world of politics and understanding of building a common world. She doesn't think violence will ever build a common world. But there are times when you need to fight. That's why she called for Jews to join an army, during the war. That's why she says in On Violence that, violence can be useful at times. It can serve justice. But most of the time she says it doesn't. And you have to be aware that if you risk violence, you could actually make it worse, not better. And you could tear things apart further than they are, right? That's how she teaches us to think about violence, not to tell us be violent or don't be violent. Here, what she's telling you is, if you want to prevent totalitarianism, the most important thing is to have a preliminary understanding that it's an evisceration of freedom. This is not about how to prevent it in the extreme, but it is about how to fight it in a longer term battle, which is that if you really want to fight it, you're going to have to build a new world, a new politics. and have us have something to fight for, not just fight against. That's, I take it, her point. That doesn't mean, that you should never put your body on the line, which is something we should all be thinking about, sadly to say. Tara.
Hi, I had so many questions. I'll try to keep it brief. I'll go with a more upbeat one. So I really was fascinated by her analysis of the role of the historian and this pivot between the event being both the end and the beginning. And I started thinking about her other writing on the role of the storyteller and the poet. And I started wondering, is there really any difference between the historian and the poet or the creative artist for her in that role of kind of, making the story, making the narrative, or how would they be distinguished? Or am I right to see that they have a similar impulse?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. No, I mean, you're absolutely right to see that they have, I mean, she sees historians as storytellers. And she sees, and so on the one hand, they're very similar. I was just thinking because, I mean, clearly they're also different. Historians are storytellers that are supposed to be true to the facts as well as telling a story. Whereas fiction writers can tell the truth, but don't have to be true to the facts. I mean,
but they're both trying to make meaning, correct?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Okay.
They're both engaged in the process of making meaning. What she's saying here in this essay and in many others is that modern historians have come under the guise of science, under the dictates of science, and insofar as they have, they've stopped trying to make meaning. They've tried to find causal explanations instead of meanings. And, she would include Hegel in that, and she would include Marx in that, by the way. To the extent that Marx sees history as the unfolding of natural law or economic laws of historical of materialism, she would include Marx within that as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the artist might, or the poet might be the one who also then puts the imagination that she mentions at the end.
Yeah, I mean, you could also argue that her work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, is an imaginative work of history in that sense, right? I think that's right.
Thank you.
Yep. Stephen or Stefan? I'm not sure which.
If it's I that you're looking at, that's who's talking.
Okay. Do you prefer Stephen or Stefan, just so I know?
Oh, not Stefan at all. Steve or Stephen, but not Stefan, please.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
Thank you so much. It's an awkward name. I've wrestled with this for over about 75 years. Three quick things. If preliminary understanding precedes knowledge, true understanding follows knowledge, what exactly is the value of the knowledge? And how does this become anything other than, as Rick pointed out earlier, circular or a confirmation of one's own biases? That's my one little shot. The second one is, I was most interested in Arendt's reference to Solomon and his asking for an understanding heart. And I wondered if that heart would relate in some way to Ayala's quest for something that's outside the ordinary understandings of the word understanding. And I think I'll leave it at that, because there are other people who are wanting to get in on on things. So thanks for your time.
I appreciate that, Stephen. So the role of knowledge in Arendt, she's certainly not a Luddite,
No.
and she's not anti-science or anti-knowledge. She is worried that science is pushing away understanding and thinking, and saying that only things that matter are things that can be proven or made certain. And since understanding and thinking are about meaning, which can never be proven or made certain, we increasingly devalue thinking and understanding at the expense of knowledge or science. What she says about science here is simply that science can illuminate, but neither prove nor disprove the uncritical preliminary understandings from which they start. If the scientist, misguided by the very labor of his inquiry, begins to pose as an expert in politics and to despise the popular understanding from which he started, he loses immediately the Ariadne thread of common sense, which will guide him through the labyrinth of his results. It's simply to say that science can do many things. It can put people on the moon. It can crack the atom. It can allow you and I to talk over these stupid machines. But it can't tell us whether we should or what we should read, or indoctrinate us and tell us what books to read. And as soon as the scientist can tell us the earth is warming, but he can't tell us what we should do about it. And as soon as they do, and they claim that they have some scientific authority, that's when she thinks they've lost their grasp on a common world. On the question of King Solomon, that's a great line, isn't it? A great paragraph. He asks for the gift of an understanding heart, and she says, as far removed from sentimentality as it is as from paperwork, the human heart is the only thing in the world. She must have been grading papers. I don't know. Only thing in the world that will take upon itself the burden that the divine gift of action of being a beginning, and therefore being able to make a beginning, has placed upon us. That a human understanding heart and not mere reflection or mere feeling makes it bearable for us to live with other people, strangers forever in the same world, and it makes possible for them to bear with us. I mean, God, if everyone in the country had to read some King Solomon right now, we'd all be in better shape, wouldn't we? I think maybe not. I don't know. I think what she's aiming at with this understanding heart is a heart that is willing to put yourself in the place of other people, which is what she'll call thinking 20 years after this, right?
Yeah.
I think. I don't know.
Yeah. In this way, she's sliding back into Dilthey territory in a way. The understanding is empathy, I think.
Well, I mean, she's avoiding that. She's saying let's not.
Yes, true enough. Yeah.
Not go in the way of feeling, right? Not mere reflection or mere feeling.
But it's some kind of.
It's a kind of understanding that people have their own.
Yeah.
That everyone has their own heart and their own soul, and that we have to understand them, not have empathy with them, but understand them.
Yeah.
It's a big difference.
Yeah. And it's not just a matter of logic or mental something or other.
But we have to understand that they have their opinions and we have ours. We can think their opinions are wrong and we can think they're awful.
Yes.
But first we have to try and understand them and understand their right to have them.
Yeah. Yeah. All good. Thank you.
Fran, I'm going to go for about 10 more minutes or so, and then I got to run. And we have oh my God. Fran, maybe try and keep the questions quick, and I'll do as many as I can.
Okay, in terms of understanding, I'm trying to understand my neighbor, He's 84 years old. He lives in upstate New York, and I moved at the beginning of the pandemic upstate in a small cabin. So my question goes to understanding, non-understanding, and violence. And I go to my neighbor, who I said is 84 years old, once a week to buy eggs and cheese. And he lives in the woods. And last Wednesday, when I went, he had cut down 12 acres of his woods, 12 acres of his trees. And I was shocked because it looked pretty desolate. And I said, Vincent, why did you cut down those trees? And he said, because they're so stupid. I could not take how stupid they are. And so it was not, the trees were not ugly. He did not make $1 with cutting down these trees. He turned them all into wood chips and will burn the rest in a big fire. They were not poisonous. They were not overgrowing his garden. My question now is like, how do I make sense of Vincent being so offended by the stupidity of his trees that he had to cut and burn them, 12 acres of it?
Every twist of that story was unexpected to me. That's wonderful. I mean, wonderful question. What a story. You should write something about it. I mean, to go back to what Stephen and I were talking about, you can have empathy with Vincent. Maybe he's 84, maybe I don't know, maybe something's wrong. And you can try and understand him. He has an opinion. I don't know what caught, it may take a little bit more talking to him to ask why they were stupid. I mean, do you think is he all there?
Well, it actually took 2 hours to figure out why he did it. So we talked about it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I mean, was it just a whim, or does he actually have a reason?
Yes, he had a reason, like we all have reasons, and that's why it took, he asked, how do you feel about it? And I said, or what do you think about this? And I said, I don't think anything, it breaks my heart. And then I think he and his wife tried to spend the next 2 hours to mend my heart by putting what they had done into context. They showed me fossils that they had found on the land, and they said well, why is it such a big deal that we cut down the trees? 10,000 years ago, there was an ocean here. It's not such a big change. And then they tried to, I don't know, there were a million reasons. I cannot tell them all right now because we don't have the time, but they bargained rationally what they had done, basically.
Yeah, I have no idea why. I mean, I think it's a fantastically interesting story. It's sad.
But my main question is, okay, how is this violence, or what I perceived as a violent act? I don't know if it was violent or not, but I perceived it this way. How is that connected to not understanding? Why did he make this? I don't know. What was it about?
I mean, what she says is that the understanding heart is concerned with the darkness of the human heart and the peculiar density which surrounds everything that is real. And it's an attempt to understand the darkness and the density. She says in another book, in On Revolution, she says that in every human heart is really awful things. People have awful views and opinions, and if we actually knew what people thought most of the time, we would probably hate all of humanity. And that's why we need an understanding heart. And true understanding does not tire of the interminable dialogue and vicious circles, because it trusts that imagination eventually will catch at least a glimpse of the always frightening light of truth. With Vincent, I don't know. But maybe there is some frightening light of truth in what he did.
I mean, like another question that is coming up for me is like, why am I slightly attracted to Vincent's act of expressing something?
I get that.
And that leads to me wondering, like, why are people attracted to Trump? Like to this sort of like, also this like direct expression. It was very honest what he said, and it was very honest what he did. In a way, it was very irrational too.
Yeah. It's there's an honesty, there's a rawness to it, there's a freedom to it. And, I think you're asking an excellent question. Why are people attracted to freedom, even when it's things we find we don't like? And I think it's true. I don't know how much more I can say about it, Fran. I think it's, you've touched on something very deep with that. And I think it's very much what Arendt is saying, is that those are the kind of conversations we have to have. Not because you're going to convince Vincent and he's going to convince you, but because they expand the perspective of our world. They expand our understanding of the brilliance and complexity and plurality of the world. Which is important, she thinks. By the way, that idea is in the central essay of The Promise of Politics, which is, I guess, the next book we're going to read. So we'll get there on that. But yeah, that's a lot of what she's writing about in that book.
Okay. Thank you.
Liz Robow?
Robow, yeah.
Hi.
Hi. I was really struck by what she said about a new word in popular language marking a new event and understanding, and just the fact that Nazism was referred to as imperialism for a while because the term totalitarianism didn't exist. And it just struck me as so true. And then that word becomes generalized and it kind of normalizes what was referred to as new in the first place. And I feel like we're living in a time like that right now where we don't really have the word to describe what's happening. So we're all muddling through and trying to understand it, and we don't really yet. But I guess I was curious about that process of muddling and whether Arendt would describe that as just something that is kind of human nature because we have this desire to make something normal to us, or if it is more because of forces of totalitarianism that the word gets generalized and you don't fully understand it.
Well, I think it's more the former right now. It is, well, maybe it's both. Because we live in a world in which we don't have shared standards of judgments and shared criteria of thought, we flee the world. And we actually think that we can make up our own ideas, right? It was an essay we read recently where we talked about how for her, I think it was A Table with Hitler, was it? Where, she talks about how if somebody thinks of themselves as great, we will see them as great. And she repeats that idea in this essay as well, where she's talking about advertising. You know, when there are no common standards, anyone can elevate themselves. And so one thing you have is lots of people offering answers and ideas. At the same time, there's a general need or feeling of a need for answers. And there are a lot of things that fill that need. You know, one can be ideology, another can be advertising, but a third is speculations by intellectuals and experts. And so, you know, I think one of the, I mean, this is where I guess what I wanted to answer your question. I think one of the reasons we don't stumble around right now is because, for the most part, we have thousands of experts telling us what's going on and providing us plausible theories. And there's such a market for these experts that we all sort of, you know, look to them to tell us. And, you know, Arendt has very little respect for those experts. She thinks that in trying to explain what's going on and provide deeper causes and theories, they actually are preventing the kind of thoughtful understanding that she thinks is necessary. Did I get close to your question?
Sort of. I don't think there is really an answer on why our language gets muddled, but it's just something to think about.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, well, why our language gets muddled? I mean, largely because everyone thinks they can speak their own way and doesn't have to be understood by anyone else. I mean, this is something she talks about a lot. Everyone thinks they can use words to mean whatever they want. And, you know, conservatism, racism, sexism. I mean, we use these words today. Who can tell you what they mean in 90% of the time they're being used? They're being used differently by different people. And that's part of the problem. Liberalism, what is liberalism today? I mean, it's a senseless, what is democracy today? It's a senseless word. And yet we use them and everyone uses them their way, and there's very little sense of a common standards or criteria. And in such a world, it's hard to have a conversation. That's part of what's going on. So, I mean, she makes a plea to use words carefully, but unfortunately, I have a fear that plea has fallen on very deaf ears in our time. All right, last question, Lauren. I'm sorry, I have to go. We're already 15 minutes over.
Hi, thank you for taking this. So the question I have is about newness.
Newness.
Which I know natality, the idea that she threads through so many works. I just worry that she really undercuts herself sometimes. And in this essay, I think it happens a little bit where it seems she's really trying to show newness as both positive, that it can go great, and then negative, that it can go really badly. And so totalitarianism is a newness in this way. I think that's what am I right with that? Like that it's never always good. It can be very bad. And so that part of it feels like it's so fragile then to say that, you know, that the supreme capacity of man is beginning. It just feels like it's not a supreme capacity.
You're right. It can be terrible.
It can be awful, right? So
yeah, very much so. She knows that. I mean, you know, man, you know, she says, look, the way man used to be judged on greatness, and greatness has nothing to do with morality. You know, absolutely. She doesn't think man is that's why she doesn't like the word progress or the idea of progress. She doesn't think man is a moral being. She thinks man is a creative being, is an active being, not a moral being. Now, man, one of the capacities man has is to make judgments and to build a common world and have an understanding heart. And in acting, there's the hope and maybe even an expectation that most of the time we will act to create and build a common world that will be understanding of other people and thus pluralistic and representing and respectful of the plurality of what man is. But not always, right? And if we try and create a world where we make it impossible to create evil, we'll have to get rid of man, because man has the capacity of evil inside of him, them. And so, yeah, the instinct to neuter evil is the instinct to neuter humanity, without a doubt, for her.
Thank you.
I'm going to have to end there. Samantha, are you on? Do you want to stay with people and answer some more questions? I haven't heard from Samantha today. I don't know if she's here.
He doesn't appear on the list.
I apologize. I have to go. It's 2:50. I'm already going to be late. Please enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll continue this next week, because the next essay on the nature of totalitarianism is, in a sense, the second part of this essay. So we'll have a chance to continue a lot of these thoughts for next week. Thank you all very much, and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt.